What's up, Shadespire players? Time to finish out our look at the Farstriders faction, its expansion for Warhammer Underworlds Tactics and Shadespire. Now, this time around, we're going to look at their unique factional ploys. Now, this is going to be where the faction comes together and kind of gives us an idea how it's intended to be played and kind of gives us some ideas of what we can do with it as we're going forward in the meta. And also, this is going to tell us what we can expect when we're playing against this faction. Now, when we originally looked at the characters themselves, we saw that they seemed very versatile. They were very interesting. They got strong defense, movement. They're reasonably good in melee, and they have unmatched range capability in Shadespire right now. When we got to the objectives, we got a little bit confused because they seemed to be a little bit scattered. We didn't know where they fit and what gives them unique abilities, or at least unique win conditions, because they seem to be kind of all over the place. When we looked at the upgrades, there we kind of saw that these are meant to be a very versatile faction, one that's going to switch strategies on a moment's notice. And in fact, that seems to be the core first order optimal strategy with the Farstriders. So my theory is, before we go into this, that I think that the ploys are going to reinforce that mechanic and that gameplay strategy. But we'll see. Let's jump right in. I'm really excited to finish this off, so let's see what we've got. Alright, Patient Defense. The first friendly fighter to be targeted by an attack action in the next activation has +1 defense. Okay, pretty solid. We have seen that the Farstriders do tend towards defensive play. Once inspired, they will go to 2 defense anyway. So this is a good way if you're expecting an attack to come in, and as a competitive Shadespire player, this is a critical skill for you to develop. Once you expect that attack to come in, this is going to give you a statistically much higher chance of blocking that attack, and in most circumstances this is going to cause your opponent to switch plays once he sees that he's unlikely to get this attack through. And if he doesn't absolutely have to make that attack, he's probably going to want to make that attack on the next activation. As we go on through Shadespire and the different cards that are available for it, I tend to think of these cards less as defense and more of an opponent manipulation type of card. So yeah, this is a good, solid card. It's not something that really blows my hair back, but I can definitely see this appearing in most Farstrider decks. Lightning Stride. Double the move characteristic of the first friendly fighter to make a move action in the next activation. They may not make a charge action. Once they have moved, they cannot be activated again in this phase. Alright, so if the verbiage here is familiar to you, it's because it's the exact same verbiage from the Sprint card. Where this matters is that Farstrider players are going to have access to 2 sprints. Given that you've got movement values of 4, 3, and 3, this is going to be very good for getting them across the field in a hurry. Especially because their Inspire condition is to end an action phase in the opponent side of the board. This is also a good way to maybe start. Again, this is going back to the idea of changing up your strategy mid-game. This is a good way to start on your backfield as far back as you can, goad the enemy into moving towards you under a hail of fire, and then at the very last minute, charge all the way across the board and leave your opponent in the middle of the board with nothing to do. I'm a big fan of Sprint anyway, and having 2 of these is fantastic. However, that play that I mentioned does have a lot of ifs to it. It's going to be dependent on whether or not that's 6 movement or 8 movement in the case of Farstrider himself. is going to get you all the way across the board, or rather to where you need to be. It's a question of whether you're going to draw both of these cards in the same opening hand, which in order to do that particular strategy you would need to. Conversely, however, just having those in there will give you a nice option even if you only get one at a time. The major downside of this and sprint, though, is because it functions in the way that a charge does, in that it blocks off the rest of the activation, and you don't get the benefit of the attack that comes at the end of a charge. I'm a little charge happy myself, as anybody who's been watching the channel probably knows by now. I play way too aggressively, so I end up charging a lot, and I end up paying for it. So it's a little bit painful for me to get the penalties of charging, but not the bonus of that sweet, sweet attack that comes with it. You've only got 3 fighters in this faction, so losing out on potential attacks can be very difficult for you. Moving on. Lightning Blow. First attack action in the next activation has +1 damage. Okay. Very, very simple wording here. Very open and easy to use. Not a lot of moving parts here. You just need to attack somebody in your next activation to do +1 damage. Other cards that we've seen that give you +1 damage are usually predicated on that being a melee attack at range 1 or 2. This just says any attack action. So this could be your Bolt Storm pistols. This could be Farstriders shooting the bird. Taking that 1 damage ranged attack and turning it into a 2 damage range attack. Potentially a 3 damage range attack with the bird. That's going to be a really great way to surprise kill your opponent. Especially if you've been pecking at them with 1 damage. They're not envisioning themselves in one-hit kill territory. Bam, you hit this, you turn it around, and you can surprise kill one of your enemy's critical units. I also like this particularly for Farstriders because with them throwing 3 dice on the attack, generally they're going to be very likely to actually connect with this. There's nothing worse than playing one of these next activation damage bumps and then whiffing on the attack. So yeah, very strong card. So far, from the cards we've seen, they seem to be not very situational. Not as much as other cards that we've seen that are factional ploys, that is. But they do seem to be very generally useful and very easy to use, which kind of goes along with a theory that I've been personally more sold on, and that is that this is meant to be an extremely versatile faction, a jack of all trades, master of none. Firm Footing. Roll an extra defense dice for friendly characters holding objectives in the next activation. Okay. This would probably dovetail very nicely with Fortify. For if you absolutely have to hold on to objectives and you don't think your opponent is going to use a ploy or a movement shenanigan to knock you off of that objective, I would say that this is probably a must-have for a Farstriders objective-oriented deck, especially with the omnipresence of cards like Supremacy now. You're going to want to stay on those objectives, and it's going to be really easy for somebody to just charge and knock you off of them. Again, this is another card where you're going to want to get really good at figuring when your opponent is going to try to attack you. The fact that this affects all friendly fighters makes it a little bit easier to deploy. It also makes it a little bit more difficult to deploy efficiently. So this is going to be a slightly more challenging card to use, but potentially this could be a game winner. Fearsome Roar. Choose an enemy fighter adjacent to a friendly fighter, push them 1 hex. Okay, again, very simple, very easy to pull off. You can try to play keep away with this faction, and this faction certainly does have a lot of tools to do that, but at some point you are going to get charged. Now, assuming that you haven't been killed by that original charge, which is theoretically possible because you are not that easy to kill with 2 defense dice and a pretty decent 4 health. This lets you receive that original hit, go, okay, you have now charged, you can't do anything. I'm going to bump you into a compromising position. Or if for some reason they've just moved up to you and you suspect that they're going to try to attack you later, you can ruin that plan. I'm always a big fan of any card that causes you to move something 1 hex, especially your opponent's fighters. And while this does need to be a little bit more specific with that rule that it needs to be a enemy fighter adjacent to a friendly fighter, that's exactly the place where you're going to want to use this anyway. So again, another strong ploy. Rangers Advance. Choose 2 friendly fighters and push them 1 hex. Awesome. Okay, right off the bat. Keep in mind that you've only got 3 guys. Your activations are a bit of a premium, and ideally you want to spend as many of those activations shooting your opponent. But at the same time, you've got to get across the field in order to inspire. So having a push that affects 2 of your friendly fighters without a lot of requirements to it. It only has to be any 2 friendly fighters. There must be 2 friendly fighters, but they don't have to be adjacent to each other. They don't have to be in any particular place. You can also use this defensively if your opponent is moving to close in melee. Or you can use this offensively to arrange your fighters to use their surprisingly powerful melee options. Again, I'm always a big fan of movement shenanigans, and this is the shenaniganist of the ones that we've seen so far in this deck. Rapid Volley. Reaction, play this after a friendly fighter's Boltstorm Pistol or Overcharge Boltstorm Pistol attack action. That fighter can make another Boltstorm Pistol or Overcharge Boltstorm Pistol attack action that targets the same fighter. Okay, this is a double tap. It's a really good double tap because not only are you getting an opportunity to do an extra damage, which you probably will because you've got a very accurate attack, you're also getting an extra knockback. Keep in mind how this would interact with, say, Shattering Terrain, where each pushback would cause an additional damage, or the use of Trap to add in a little extra damage. This can turn a relatively weak 1 damage attack into a kill shot. I think this is probably designed to be one of the core cards for the faction, probably intended by Games Workshop as an auto-include, but again, I hardly ever believe in auto-includes. That being said, this one is really close, and I really, really like it. It's the only ways in which this could be difficult to pull off or problematic. You still have to actually hit with both attacks. Again, not necessarily an unlikely thing, but it can happen. This is a game of random number generation. The other problem that you could run into, that attack has to target that same fighter, so be very careful about when you are applying pushbacks. You can actually push them out of your effective range. Beyond that, it does have to be the same fighter, so you can't shoot one guy and be so inspired as to shoot the other. Again, those are small caveats to this card. I think it's extremely strong. and I would probably put it in almost any Farstrider deck. Retribution. That's some great art on this one. Reaction. Play this after an attack action that damages a friendly fighter. That fighter can make an attack action that must target the attacker. Okay, I like anytime you are able to get extra attacks out of sequence, you've got a huge advantage. A major part of Shadespire's design is that you're working with a maximum of 12 activations. This was kind of clarified in the FAQ, but because this specifies a particular type of action that is an attack action, you could do this after you have charged. It also doesn't specify what attack action this has to be, though given the other wording on the card, it's probably going to be a melee attack. But this is going to be a good surprise attack to punish your opponent for attacking one of your guys. If you've already played defensive up until this point, your opponent has probably had to expend a lot of resources in order to get that attack off in the first place, which makes this hit back all that much sweeter. Okay, moving forward. Steady Volley. First friendly fighter to make a Boltstorm pistol or overcharge Boltstorm pistol attack action in the next activation can be pushed 1 hex before they do so. That's not bad. It's a little bit specific, but basically this is a free. It's a free 1 hex move. It could turn something that was going to be a charge into just an attack, which will allow you to attack more. This can help you get across the field into enemy territory so that you can inspire while still putting out damage. It seems like one of the major disadvantages with the Farstriders is dealing with having to spend activations on things that are not shooting, but at the same time we have a bunch of ploys and a couple of upgrades that are going to allow us to mitigate that particular problem. Warning Cry. Choose a friendly fighter and put them on guard. Alright. I like this quite a bit. And I liked it a lot when it was a Stormcast. Or I should say a Liberator card. Being able to go on guard is a huge bonus. Not quite so much for a shield defense die faction. It's a little bit better for a dodge defense die faction. But it still greatly increases your defensive ability. There are some other effects that are going to affect guard later on that we'll see. And so this is going to be worth keeping in the back of your mind. It's also worth considering that once you are on guard, you don't lose it until the end of the turn or if you charge. So you can go on guard, you can still move around and shoot all day. If you can get a person onto an objective, throw them on guard, even though they're standing way out in the middle of nowhere on an objective, they'll still be able to contribute damage by shooting their Boltstorm pistol. But at the same time, if they're attacked, they're going to be much more difficult to take out. Especially if you consider all of the other defensive bonuses that the Farstriders have. I think this goes right in line with some of the core strategies that are becoming apparent to the Farstriders. It's not quite as good as the Liberator card that puts 2 adjacent fighters on guard, but that would be out of character, I think, for this faction. They're not meant to stand next to each other, whereas the Liberators are meant to be in a shield wall. Okay, and that's the last of them. So, overall, looking at the Farstriders faction, we were intrigued by their core stats. We were disappointed by their objectives. We were confused by their upgrades, and it all came together with the ploys. The ploys, in particular, are excellent for this faction. And interestingly, a lot of people have been comparing Magor's Fiends to the Iron Jaws. I think, personally, this seems more like Iron Jaws to me, because the major benefits that you have here are going to be in your character's stats on their card, which are across the board excellent, and your ploys. Iron Jaws have excellent ploys, in my opinion. In fact, it's kind of a problem with them because they've got so many good ploys, it becomes hard to put anything else into your deck. I think a lot of people are probably going to have the same problem with this faction. For those playing against this particular faction, it does mean that it's going to be slightly easier to predict what's in your opponent's deck before you play against it. Chances are, if you think a card in here is an auto include, your opponent might think so as well. So as you're playing against this faction, be sure to plan around that. Be ready to counter those when they come up. All that being said, I do think that this is a really fun looking faction. I can't wait to put them out on a table to see what they're capable of. I think they're a very much finesse faction. I don't think that this is necessarily going to be that good for beginners. All the factions in the game are reasonably good for beginners, but I think this one, much like the Sepulchral Guard, is really going to reward a very canny player. It's also going to greatly punish mistakes. Anyway, I would love to hear what your opinions are. Please feel free to comment down below. Tell me if you agree, disagree, share your own thoughts about how these cards speak to you. And in the meantime, please like, share, and subscribe this video to help us bring you more Warhammer Underworlds content. Until the next time, have a great one.